And welcome. Hello and welcome to this First Monday Forum. I'm Nick Cull of the USC Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is going to focus on broadcasting to the Soviet Union, particularly in the 1980s. Both as a history and a precedent for broadcasting to Russia today. And maybe at the end of the session, we'll get into recommendations for what can best be done today. I'm delighted to welcome three distinguished authors who've created, I think, really interesting books on this subject, and a great colleague to comment on the material presented. So the speakers, in order of appearance, will begin with Michel Daniel, who's a musician and podcaster and author of The DJ Who Brought Down the USSR, The Life and Legacy of Seva Novgorodsev, which is coming out next year. And Novgorodsev was the principal rock DJ of the BBC Russian service. After Michel, we'll hear from Mark Pomar, who's a veteran of VOA and RFERL, and he's the author of Cold War Radio, the Russian broadcasts of VOA and RFERL, and that just came out with Potomac Books. And Mark is currently at the Clements Center for National Security at University of Texas. And then Jean Parta, who's also a veteran of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where he ran the audience analysis. He is author of Under the Radar, Tracking Western Radio Listeners in the Soviet Union, which is just out from Central European University Press. And then I'll invite Vasily Gatov, who's a colleague from the Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy at USC, who is both a longtime listener or in the 80s was a longtime listener to Western broadcasting as a citizen of the Soviet Union, and at some points was a jammer of Western broadcasts. So I think that's a great lineup to drill into this subject, but can I give the floor to Michel?
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to Public Diplomacy Council of America for inviting me to this really extraordinary panel, and I'm very thrilled to be able to present my research about, as Nick said, Seva Novgorodsev, who was amazing DJ with the BBC Russian service from 1976 until 2015 when he retired. So because he began in the late 70s, he was well suited for broadcasting rock music, which was rushing into the Soviet Union at this time from the West. And it was also encountering a lot of, the genre itself was encountering a lot of pushback from the Kremlin, which was seeking to restrict the amount of Western music that was available, because it was afraid that it was infecting the minds of youth, that it was going to be messing with the general Soviet way of life. And this is partially correct. So when Seva Novgorodsev arrived in London in 1976, he initially did not have any intentions of broadcasting rock music, but by some fortuitous circumstances, the pop music program from London was without a presenter. And so Seva, being a jazz musician, which is one of the very interesting things about him that made him so relevant and so perfect for this task, he became the DJ for this program. And the program was eventually renamed to Rock po Sevi, which means rock the Seva way, essentially. And it was renamed to that because the BBC realized that Seva, by whatever it was he was doing at the time, was gathering listeners by the millions. And this is not unlike the way Willis Conover of Voice of America was gathering young listeners across the USSR. And in fact, Willis Conover, having broadcast in earlier decades prior to Seva, was somebody to whom Seva listened religiously. And so Seva already had this influence from the West, from Voice of America specifically. And so when he came to the BBC, he was bringing a lot of his own experiences as a listener. But of course, Seva was broadcasting in the Russian language, and he did a few interesting things. One was he didn't just broadcast Western rock music, but he also provided information about the bands, about the West itself. He was providing cultural information, and he was more importantly speaking to people on a very personal level. And as you recall, I've said that he was a jazz musician, and he was not just any jazz musician. He actually had some level of renown in the Soviet Union, and he had traveled the breadth of the USSR. So from Petersburg to the Sakhalin Islands near Japan, he knew the audience. He had seen the breadth of disparity across the USSR, and so and he had achieved a level of empathy for the people of the Soviet Union. And even though he was intelligentsia, and most intelligentsia, as most scholars will note, were afraid of the great unwashed masses, he was not. He was very much in tune to their suffering and felt it very keenly. And so as a result of this, he was convicted on a level that he would not have been otherwise if he hadn't been a musician, if he hadn't seen for himself what was going on in the USSR and how communism was not exactly providing the needs of the people, was not meeting those needs. So in his broadcast, he was very much convicted about trying to entertain these bored and disenfranchised youth in particular, because he felt that this generation was most distanced from the leadership in the USSR. They could not find themselves a good role model in the Politburo, in the Komsomol, which is the state youth organization. And so he was speaking to them on a very personal level. And even though he was, by the time he started broadcasting, he was already 37 years old. And this put him at a quite of an age disparity. However, listeners will note in the many letters that they sent to him, and also the many listeners that I was able to interview, that he was like a father figure, that he was as a friend, that he was as a brother. And this was very interesting, because he did essentially create a gigantic family on air. So he was able to, through his broadcast, through the fact that he was being real with people and trying to talk to them on their level, he created this community in the ether that both superseded the Soviet bubble and then also somehow circumvented the politics that were going on internationally. So the great political divides between communism and capitalism. And so, as I mentioned, Seva received a great deal of letters, and a lot of these letters are now actually at Stanford in the Hoover archives. But most of the letters were blocked by the KGB, and so writers will say that this is their 25th epistle, or this is their 7th, 8th, 9th time they're trying to get to him, and we have no hope of reaching you, but somehow miracle number. I think even one was like their 60th letter, and so he called the listener on air when he read the letter, our beloved Shestisyatniki, so which is very sweet, and people would even respond to letters that they had heard being read on air. So again, there was all this correspondence going back and forth, and And out of this correspondence, there was actually the suggestion to create a rock music appreciation club, and essentially it was almost like a Seva Novgorodsev appreciation society as well. And this one letter written from a very remote part of northern Russia, one listener who was in this very tiny town, I believe it was near Arkhangelsk, he suggested, let's create a fan club, and he and people actually started writing to him and saying, oh yes, this is a great idea. And so out of this, there was an actual rock club that was formed. And it was largely concentrated in Western Soviet Russia. However, there were members from all over Russia, from Siberia as well. And there's so much that I can say and so much that I can go on about. But basically, when Seva finally returned to the USSR, finally visited Russia again after so many years of being away in 1990, he was met by thousands of his listeners, and all of these being young people, and he spent a great deal of time with them. And it was just amazing to see that this oft touted goal that Cold War broadcasting had of winning hearts and minds was actually a real thing. And I think Seva's story is a perfect example of how the fastidious and very these efforts that were made by the West did actually bring about yielded great fruit. And I think ultimately this is why we did help to bring about a peaceful dissolution of the USSR, was because radio broadcasting really helped to change people's hearts and minds and dissolved the idea of the Soviet Union well before it was actually dissolved.
Thanks, Michelle. Mark, so can you pick up on some of those threads? I recognize some of the themes right there in your book. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about Cold War broadcasting in the 1980s, a very important decade. I was very fortunate to join Radio Liberty in 1982 and then work at the Voice of America in the mid-80s, and then return to the Board for International Broadcasting, overseeing Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty until 1993. So that decade is extremely vivid in my mind and something that I lived through and care about. I would say the decade can be characterized by the confluence of several important factors that made broadcasting very effective. And I would just name three of them, but there are many more than just three. The first would be the approach that the Reagan administration took toward broadcasting. Reagan cited VOA and RFERL in his campaign in 1980, but most important, it came in with the seriousness of broadcasting, and with it came money, came a better budget, better technical facilities, a focus on human rights. The human rights, I would say, were underlying all of the programs that we did, both at RFERL and VOA, and we were given that impetus. So there was seriousness, and speaking of BBC, we were encouraged to have a very close relationship with BBC and other broadcasters. And in the 80s, when I was at VOA, I would spend each year a week at BBC Russian service, and the director of the Russian service of BBC would spend a week with us in Washington. The idea being that we would be discussing programs, discussing approaches, checking each other as to what worked, what didn't work, and likewise with Radio Canada International, Deutsche Welle, and with other broadcasters. So there was the impetus coming from Washington. That was number one. Number two, the elite of Russia, artists, thinkers, philosophers, were living in the West. So we had a phenomenal number of people we could draw on who had deep fan clubs, if you wish, and certainly listeners. Michelle talked about Seva Novgorodsev and jazz music. Well, we had Rostropovich and Galina Vishnevskaya in Washington, who came frequently to the VOA studio and had their millions of listeners and millions of fans as well. We had Alexander Solzhenitsyn on the air. We had Vasily Gatov reading from his work, and I could just go on for hours and hours of, I would say, every major and most minor writers, thinkers, philosophers, musicians, artists, actors were in one way or another. Baryshnikov was very frequently a guest on VOA programming and so on and so forth. So you had, on one hand, Washington providing the means, you had the diaspora, the emigres in the West, eager and willing to connect. And the third most important factor was that beginning in 1985, but really picking up speed in 86 and 87, was glasnost and the opening up and the opportunity for us to be engaged. And I think the word glasnost, I went back to the early documents of RFERL, and the word glasnost is written right there in 1948, 1949. This is the goal of the radios, is glasnost. Nobody thought about bringing down the Soviet Union. No one thought in those terms, but they did think in terms of openness, communication, ability to interact. That word was used. And of course, once Gorbachev's policies took off, and in the book, I talk about my first trip in 1987 to talk about the ending of jamming. And I was in Moscow, probably the first RFERL, connected employee to be there on official business. I'm not sure anyone had preceded me in that role. And nobody would meet with us because they weren't ready. They didn't know what the message was. But 1 year later, in the information talks that took place in 1988, very different attitude, very different approach. And once jamming ends, and it ends in November of 1988, everything changes in terms of the ability to reach. We immediately set up a office, a little bureau in Radio Liberty Bureau in Moscow. We hired freelancers. We had people broadcasting from within the Soviet Union. And I may add, by the way, that office, small as it was in late 88, early 89, was closed in February of 2022. So from 88 to 2022, there was a Radio Liberty office functioning in one way. Now under assault the last couple of years, for sure, fined and called in a foreign agent and so forth, but closed only weeks or days before the war against Ukraine. So that kind of tells you what that impact in that period. So again, I could go on for hours on this topic, but basically just to keep in mind that the power of broadcasting really came about because the Soviet Union also opened up, and we were broadcasting into a friendly and open audience. And that's very, very important to note, given today's situation, where I would wager that it's a more difficult task to reach the listener today than it was when Seva Novgorodsev or Rostropovich and others were on the air. I mean, there was receptivity in a way there is resistance now, and we could explore that if we have the time. But that in a nutshell is kind of my book, and I capture going from the time when we were toxic in 1982 to the time we were heroes in 1992.
Thanks, Mark. Let me bring in Jean at this point, because nobody knows more about the Soviet radio listener than you do, Jean. And it's wonderful that you've pulled that experience together into a really terrific book. But I pass things over to you.
Okay, I'll do things a little differently than I'd planned. I had put together a kind of a 10-minute talk here. But I'll skip around a little bit and address some of the points that have been made. But there are a few things from here that I'll take out. First, I will shamelessly say that this book is actually the third in the series. The first one, maybe some of you are familiar with this one. This was the analysis book. This is the book we did on the 50,000 interviews that we did over the years. And the second book that I co-edited with Ross Johnson came out of our conference at Stanford. And this added in contributions from analysts in the East and also documents from the secret archives that dealt with international broadcasting. So here we come to the third book. And this actually is not meant to be an analysis. It tells a story. And I do it in a first person way to tell a story of how this all came together, which was a unique Cold War operation, and how we managed to do all of this this from Paris. I'll skip over the stuff that had to do with the early years at Radio Liberty and what they did. But beginning in 1970 in France, Italy, and the Nordic countries, we systematized all of this work, and it went on for 20 years. And as I said, we did 50,000 interviews, and we worked very closely with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in terms of how we project this data onto the Soviet Union. Interviewing was relatively more difficult in the 70s and early 80s. It became considerably easier in the environment of glasnost under Gorbachev. In fact, those last years, people wanted to talk. They didn't really have to be induced very much. They wanted to talk. It was quite a change from earlier years. And we, during this, well, earlier on, we started adding in attitudinal questions. And here I'll get to a few things that did have to do with the 1980s and a couple of things. But one example of the attitudinal questions was the tracking we did of Soviet citizens on their attitudes towards the war in Afghanistan. And while at the beginning they weren't terribly interested to talk about it, they didn't really think much was going on there. But we, over the 7-8 years, we saw these attitudes move from indifference to opposition, going through several different stages along the way. But it wasn't only this data that we were able to gather that was of use. The very fact that we were able to carry it out had its own significance. And here I want to go back to an incident with Professor Vladimir Schlappentuk, one of the leading sociologists at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, who left to the West in 1979. And he was kind of wondering how we were doing all of this. And he wanted to come over and visit us and just take a serious look at it. I think he came in kind of wondering, is this really possible? Maybe he was going to be a critic. So he spent an entire day in our Paris office. It was in the mid-80s. He read our reports, looked at our questionnaires filled out by interviewers in the field, asked questions about everything. He was pushing very hard. At the end of the day, we sat down on the couch together. I think we had a glass of wine or something. And he said, you know, this has been a most interesting day for me. And I just shot back. So it shows that there's a large audience to Western radio in the Soviet Union. He said, no, we've known that for a long time. What is interesting, what strikes me is that these travelers are willing to talk to you about it. That means they're no longer afraid. And that will be very important for future developments in the Soviet Union. This was a most prescient observation, and it really turned out to be true. In fact, in many cases, they might have been more open talking to somebody overseas than they would have been back in the Soviet Union. Another major mandate of our unit was to support the broadcasting effort, not just gather numbers on this. And this involved focus groups that dealt with actual programming. They were first conducted among immigrants from the USSR in Rome, in Israel. Final years of perestroika among Soviet travelers as well. We were able to do this in Paris through an institute. And I'll show you an example of how this research directly impacted programming. As the war in Afghanistan expanded, RL's program reporting was criticized by many listeners, including those who were opposed to the Soviet invasion, because they saw its tone as bordering on schadenfreude, and because it failed to convey empathy for the loss of young Soviet soldiers. When I mentioned this to RFE-RL President Jim Buckley, he suggested that I travel to Munich to discuss it with the Russian service. Buckley held a meeting in his office, which was attended by about a dozen Russian service programs worked on in Afghanistan. Now, as Mark can tell you, these were a tough bunch of people. They were not easy to convince about anything, and they thought they knew better than anybody who was trying to tell them something. I explained that while many RL listeners agreed with the RL's general critique of the war, our data show that they were put off by a broadcast tone that failed to take listener psychology into account. Whatever listeners might think about the war in general, the loss of young Russian lives was a tragedy. Listeners sometimes sensed an undercurrent of satisfaction when RL talked about the number of Russian soldiers killed. They felt that Radio Liberty should maintain its critical stance on the war, while at the same time showing sympathy for the loss of life. The Russian service programmers listened attentively to what I had to say, which rather surprised me. And I was even more surprised that there was no real pushback from them at all. From then on, the service abandoned what could have been interpreted as a rather smug approach to Russia's problems and adopted a tone that showed more empathy for their plight. Subsequent research showed that as a result, the broadcast became considerably more effective and listeners' complaints virtually disappeared. In other words, they did just about a 180-degree turn on coverage of Afghanistan based on research. This approach might have some relevance to communicating with Russians on the war in Ukraine today.
Right.
I'm not going to go into audience numbers here. I'd like to make a comment on what Mark said in his point too about the cultural figures. Our research was showing the importance of cultural broadcasting on RL. In fact, it was one of the more important things that they did. And we constantly fed this back, and it was used to actually increase the amount of cultural programming that RL was carrying. So it was a major factor in creating again I would even say a kind of credibility about the service. And the cultural programming. Of course, we were happy to get the additional money that Reagan was giving us. This allowed us to move up, in fact, in the final years of Glasnost to be doing 4,500 to 5,000 interviews a year, which we wouldn't have had money to do earlier, nor would we have been able to, because we wouldn't have had quite the same access. The historical narrative part of my book winds up with a chapter on past successes and future challenges, and notes that one of the reasons, and this will lead into something that we can talk about, reasons for the success of international broadcasting was a sophisticated appraisal of the adversary based upon a huge research effort, largely housed in RFERL in the form of the RFERL Research Institute, which was called in later years, but the capacity existed before. It was merely consolidated at this time, which employed over 200 analysts. These were people who were familiar with the area. Many of them came from the area, all had language, and it was something that was absolutely unique in the West, used by just about everybody from government to academics to journalists. The closure of the Institute in '94 for financial reasons, the so-called peace dividend, means that an operation that played a key role in understanding the adversary no longer exists. If we are to be successful in our current communications efforts in a much more difficult media environment, a greater research effort will be necessary. The book makes a plea for such an organization and presents some thoughts on how it might be established. A short afterward examines the information war over the Soviet military invasion of Ukraine and the difficulties in communications. And this will pick up on a point that Mark already has introduced. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet public was relatively open to Western communications efforts. This is not the case now. The latter years of the USSR were marked by widespread disillusion with communism and the failure of the Soviet economic system. 3 decades of continuing economic hardship, regime floundering, and perceived political humiliation have provided fertile ground for the regime to awaken a sense of victimization and stir up Russian national patriotism in support of the war. The sanctions imposed by the West, while justified and necessary, unfortunately play into this narrative as well. These have all contributed to a climate where Western communications efforts with Russia have become considerably more difficult. I won't say impossible, because I think some stuff is getting through, but considerably more difficult, and new ways are going to have to be found to effectively reach the Russian people. But my my main point here coming out is that a once very robust research effort no longer exists. There are bits and pieces of things here, but the kind of consistent research that pulled all this together in support of the communications effort has vanished. And I think we're doing things at a relatively superficial level, although there are some good things being done. And Mark may want to talk about current time as an example of that, since he's a regular listener, but I'll not take up any more time right now on all of this.
Oh, well, thanks, Gene. Thanks. But can I bring in Vasily now with your unique perspective as being at the receiving end of this?
Hearing end of this. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this extremely interesting conversation. My notes are mostly responses, and I would probably start from a perspective which where I will fully agree with Michelle about Seva Novgorodsev's role in fostering this new audiences in Russia, in Soviet Union, starting 1977-78, when his program became kind of a paramount of BBC, and as we say, locomotive of much broader audiences that they started to reach with that, and much stronger popularity of people who, I mean, BBC had less capacity to hire extremely kind of well-versed, known Russian personalities to host the shows, or like, I don't know, Vasily Aksionov reading his beloved novels already. Or Viktor Nekrasov, a cult Russian writer who worked for Radio Liberty. And BBC was kind of much more looking into professionals rather than stars. And Novgorodsev was this paramount, which allowed other parts of BBC, Zinovy Zinnik, Masha Slonim, and other voices of BBC become extremely popular because they were surrounding his show. Another thing about Seva, whom I know pretty well personally, I would say he is an amazing storyteller, one of the best storytellers in the world. And that played an amazing role, together with his empathy and ability to merge almost fantastic reality of like backstage of Deep Purple or any other famous groups. I think he was very close with David Bowie at some time, and he was sharing the backstage events with Russian audience. And I was like, wow, it was beyond understanding that this gods of music are so close with ordinary Russian. I mean, nobody kind of received Seva as a person standing on top of the communication reality, although he was. So that's an amazing effort to write a book about Seva. I know he's working on his own memoirs right now, and I hope he will be able to finish them. And again, I mean, we should expect amazing reading in this document. Kind of the second part, I will speak about jamming, because I have really kind of strange perspective, because from 1983 to 1985, I was serving in so-called ASNAS of GRU, the Soviet radio, strategic radio intelligence. One of the tasks, side tasks, except of tracking American strategic bombers around the world and intercept the radio communications, was to assist Soviet system of jamming in putting efforts to block the access of foreign radio stations to Soviet listeners. I need to share the screen for a second just to give our viewers a perspective how big these things were. So these are kind of classic Soviet jamming towers. The one in the corner, lower right corner, is the smaller station that covers like several areas in large cities. This one is still standing in Moscow. It's a very current photograph, about probably 2 years ago. And the one on the left is a huge thing in Sestrorezhsk near St. Petersburg that particularly was engaged in preventing Radio Vatican from broadcasting on Soviet Union, because that was a particular operation which required a very powerful Radio Vatican, unlike Radio Liberty, had only one frequency, which they used for Russian broadcasts. So it was simple to jam them. And the one in the upper right corner is the kind of one of the most powerful Russian Soviet jammer stations. It's in Lviv, in Western Ukraine. Fortunately, I think it's now completely destroyed. And there were two more of this size, one in Šiauliai in Lithuania, and one in near Barnaul, which was used to cover American broadcasts from Japan and Western United States. So this is how they looked like, and this is how they tried. I mean, literally, I mean, technically, it was a very simple thing. It was like hundreds of shortwave radio stations joined together and transmitting just a noise. I mean, a crumbling noise. Not even on the exact frequency of American station, but around. I mean, making it very difficult for viewers, listeners, to kind of comfortably listen to that. Not because I mean it's impossible in the world of shortwave broadcasting to block the frequency altogether, because you change the direction of antenna, you still have the signal which comes from the other side of the world. What is interesting historically, that you said that Soviet people were able to listen on obstructed American broadcasts since November 1988. No, there were 2 more months in the history of Soviet Union when Soviet Union was not jamming anything. That was April 1975. It's a Helsinki Accord conference, and that was a particular requirement from one of the US negotiators to deputy head of Soviet delegation, General Kondrashev, who was pretending he's a diplomat, although he was the head of Department A, the disinformation department of First Chief Directorate. And he was deputy head of Russian delegation. And they asked because they wanted some particular information to kind of to reach Russians before the Helsinki Accords will be signed, mostly about the agreement on human rights. But that Helsinki Accord covers what's called the fifth package, yeah, covers the human right universalia in Europe. So that was the first month when Soviet people were able to listen to Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, not Radio Liberty, unobstructed. And the second one was the 44 days of 1980 Olympics. I don't know whether it was like this everywhere, but the western part of the Soviet Union had no jamming at all. I mean, presumably because of the large presence of foreigners, they just wanted to kind of, Soviet Union was very kind of imitative. They wanted to look rather than be. So they wanted to seem, well, we have a normal life. I mean, you can listen to Voice of America in Moscow. So again, I mean, there was no jamming for 44 days. And I remember reading this in the journal in the army because my colleagues, I mean, who served 3 years or 4 years before us were so much happy that there was no jammers working because they were recording an American station called KYOI Super Rock Joy off air. Because it was the kind of the only radio station that pumped like 24 hours rock music, rock and pop music, very current from Tokyo. And I made my service in the town of Yakutsk in eastern Siberia. So that's an abstracted view, a radio view to Japan. As far as audiences are concerned, I think Gene is right to say that in 80s, the size of the audience that listened to various foreign broadcasters which targeted Soviet population was really big. It wasn't, of course, comparable in size with people who watched Soviet television or read Soviet newspapers, but these were millions of people, and what is interesting that the kind of own political views of this slices of population were extremely diverse, from very, very pro-liberal, pro-Western, dissident, like-minded people to ultra-nationalists. I mean, people like on the fascist style Russian idea. All of them wanted to listen to that to prove their own devices. I mean, like people with liberal views, they were thinking about Zapad nam pomojet, the West will help us to change the regime, and people on the right side, they were trying to kind of to catch some information about nationalist movements and so on, and it helped them. I mean, to be honest, especially on other language services that Radio Liberty used, I mean, there was a lot of really kind of explosive information that helped many of the nationalist movements in the former Soviet republics to raise. Ukrainian service, for example, was very combatant.
Very nationalistic, yes.
Yeah, so
sometimes uncomfortably so for people at the radio.
Yeah, and but I think, I mean, concluding my remarks, I just want to say that, of course, the second half of the 80s, when Soviet Union started to change extremely fast. I mean, when you try to remember these days after kind of mid 1986, it seems like events were going with unprecedented historical speed, that things are happening in your eyes, in your ears, in your behavior, and 24 hours is not enough to kind of to say, let's say, sit and listen to radios, and people were going with their radio receivers in hand on the streets, listening to party congresses where Gorbachev was criticizing something, to the first Soviet parliament elected, I mean, broadcasts and so on. That was a pretty amazing kind of moment when live radio preoccupied people became kind of central point of delivering political messages. I would say that Radio Liberty played an astonishing role in formation of this and formation of these audiences. Of course, at the same time, to be honest, it predicted the conservation of these audiences in a way, because the dissident kind of sense of Radio Liberty remained for too long, even today. I mean, there are some people who continue this tradition to make it compatible with the current modern Russian audiences. And I think that Current Time is a great project, although there is also reasons for criticize them, to modernize and kind of develop the broadcast. So yeah, I stop here and go to questions.
Well, I think it's tremendous to see the thread that links our panelists' remarks. The power, I knew that a discussion about radio would deal with listening, but you've made it clear that the important listeners are the people who make the radio programs, responding to what the audience actually needs. And the second point is that really this is a kind of love story, and that if the broadcaster doesn't love and doesn't feel a connection to the audience can tell. And Novgorodsev's achievement was to communicate his love for his country, and sometimes, acknowledging that he's different from the West, using the language that shows that the slang that shows that he's part of the Soviet Union. And so there's love in each of these stories, and that's not a word we hear very much in public diplomacy, but I think it's one that is essential to broadcasting and the choices audiences make. But what I want you to do to pull this all together is, what do we do today? Mark's made it clear that this is a very different situation today. Trying to reach the Russian audience in Putin's Russia is a very different process. But what clues do you feel should be should go to RFERL, VOA, and other broadcasters looking to, and we know that the broadcasters are being attended to in Putin's Russia, but what lessons do you think they should draw from this history?
Can I jump in for a second?
Please.
I am a regular contributor, occasional contributor to Current Time and to Radio Liberty and to VOA. And I, by the way, what I watch and listen to, I think is very, very good. And they have a very difficult task that we did not have, and that is to reflect the war in Ukraine at the same time as people have noted, maybe not necessarily love, that may be too strong, but certainly a respect for the audience and a certain understanding where they find themselves at the moment. I think the task is extremely difficult, but I think at the end of the day, you've got to be truthful and people will respect you for presenting what is there. I think that the task of the Russian service of VOA and RL is to present and to be as factually accurate and to bring the war home to Russia, because that is what the Russian media is not doing. So whether or not it's going to be immediately accepted or accepted over time as the situation gets worse and worse, but I think first and foremost is not to mince words, but to really bring that war with all of its horrors to the Russian people without necessarily blaming them for what is happening. And I think we were very, very careful in my time at VOA and RL is not to assign guilt to our listeners over what the Communist Party was doing and what the government was doing. I mean, that separation has to be there. And I think that's a very important one now more than ever, to communicate that this is what is happening in your name, but not necessarily you yourself, listener in Siberia or Irkutsk or wherever, are necessarily doing. But you should be aware that in your name, this is being waged. And I think that's probably the toughest challenge.
Thank you. Michelle, what thoughts do you have when you look at the situation today?
Yeah, it's I completely agree with Mark. Truth over over anything else is extremely important. I feel that, and this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time, even before the war, is that the youth of Russia, Ukraine, wherever, they're not engaged, and it's hard to engage them. It's extremely hard because we're in a social media environment and there are a million distractions. Like I think Jean said, this is a very difficult media environment overall. And you know, if you don't want to be, if you don't want to engage, you don't want to connect, you don't want to inform yourself, you're more than welcome to pack your head with a lot of other things. So I think looking to Zelensky and what he did during his presidential campaign is probably one of the most telltale signs of how you do engage with youth today. And I do think youth are extremely important because they are the change-making generation always, no matter when or where or what country we're talking about. Youth are the ones that are always kind of dictating how social politics goes. So Zelensky using Instagram very skillfully, even though I don't know that he was necessarily like, he wasn't a marketing guru or anything like that, but he was honest, and he was kind of, or at least conveying the sense that he was honest and, you know, showing himself. And, you know, in much the same way that Seva did through on the BBC Russian service, he was showing himself, and people appreciated that, and youth particularly appreciated that because parents are always lying to their kids. So I do that all the time. So I think this honesty, this truth, this sense of clarity and just, you know, being genuine. Yes, being genuine. That's what youth want to see, and they don't want this fake stuff, and they believe every government, every institution, everything is fake. So how do we get to them today? That's the real question.
Jean, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think both Michelle and Mark have made the critical point here. It is staying true to your own values, to your own journalistic values, of being truthful. It's not going to win things over in the short run, and maybe not even in the medium run, but I think in the long run it will. And this is where we have to maintain credibility through a rough patch that we're going through right now. And I think there are going to be all kinds of temptations to look for some kind of silver bullet or some kind of gimmick that's going to work. I don't think there is one out there. So I think staying true to our values of honest reporting is going to make a difference here over the long run. There's another thing here too, is that, and this is being done, is providing all kinds of technical information that allow people to actually find these various messages that are coming in. That is being worked at, and but I think maybe the effort has to be doubled up.
And
yeah, all of this kind of stuff. Some of it's whack-a-mole, but they keep on doing it. And I know RL is very has on its own website all kinds of information of how to get information, how to get things in. I had one. Oh yeah. I want to get back to this point of we have to really study our adversary much better than we are doing right now, and go back to a Cold War approach to doing this. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of young Russians outside the borders of Russia right now and in the neighboring countries. And I think what we need is something like, you know, the Harvard Project, you know, among emigres in Europe after the Second World War, to look at this generation, to study what is the post-Putin generation going to look like? What are their values? Where are they going? How do we communicate with these people now? So I would make a pitch for a a real serious research effort among all of these people who are
Could I
in
jump
Europe.
immediately on that, Gene, and go to something that Mike Schneider's raised in the questions, and that to go to Mark? Are the Russians now living outside of the country, including the people who are avoiding military service, that they are surely an audience for international broadcasting, not only as a source for information on the country, but are we doing programming for those people?
My sense is that current time is very much geared toward any Russian speaker, not necessarily Russians within Russia, but any Russian speaker, and it could very well be people living in outside in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. I also would add that there are many smaller efforts by journalists who have left Russia, who are now living in the Baltic states or in the United States, who have their own YouTube channels, they have their own means of getting across. And I've been invited as a guest on some of these programs where they have quite a large audience, considering it's a one-person operation in many cases, precisely trying to reach people outside of Russia or in Russia, but certainly outside as well. So the radios are a major source because they have the ability to do intensive and extensive broadcasting. But there are a lot of small efforts, people who used to work for Echo of Moscow who are now living in Europe doing their own YouTube channels and so forth. So there's a considerable variety of different sources, and I think that's also to be encouraged because they're reaching other types of audiences.
And Mark, Philip Brown asked a question about what platform are we using? So it's not shortwave now.
No, there's no shortwave.
Services.
The shortwave stations were torn down in Spain and in Portugal, and I believe the US may have some, but there's some shortwave on VOA going to Africa and Asia and so forth, but I'm not an expert on it, but I don't believe there's any going in at all. It's really on the different platforms like YouTube and internet and so forth. And a lot of television, we talk about radio, but most of what current time is television. It's not radio, it's TV.
Could we go to Vasily for, I guess it's going to be a wrap-up comment from...
Well, look, I want to say kind of two things on how to deal with this now and in the future. First of all, yes, kind of stick to journalistic values, to truth, to objectivity, while a display of multitude of opinions as well is a very correct path to sort of keep your station or your media channel credibility, and it's kind of sustaining for the future. On the other hand, I mean, speaking about particular goals that media could achieve in kind of dealing with Russian audiences that are, well, at least hostile or probably just ignorant to Western messaging right now. I think the Seva's ideas, I mean, are probably still alive. You need to kind of return a comfortable, warm, empathic storytelling back into communication with Russians. Mm-hmm. Probably slow, probably without kind of things that current television so much likes, the flashes. I mean, it's happening now. Let's see how they kill each other in real time. No, completely opposite. And we can see that most of successful Russian talk shows are very slow storytelling, like Dutz, like Irina Shikman interviews, like Ekaterina Gordeeva interviews. These are slow talks. I mean, about things that are not directly related to war, political conflict, Putin's atrocities, whatever. This is more about how people should live, how people should survive psychologically in a very, very, very intense and difficult situation they have now in Russia. That is very difficult to justify for USAGM because them dreaming about the silver bullet. Jim was speaking that one day somebody speaks something on
Move the needle.
Current time and revolution explodes in Russia. That will never happen. This is not possible anymore. So my judgment is that you need much more balanced conversation, and it should be exactly conversation with Russian audiences about things that are outside of agenda, in my immediate political or foreign policy agenda.
RL used to have several programs that were like that by people who were known in Russia.
Yeah, like Vladimir Tol's programs, Ivan Tolstoy programs.
Yeah,
that's something that is in a way the value that Radio Liberty had in the past, but in order to kind of to convert them into modern time, I mean, you can't use like 70 or 90-year-old person there. I mean, Tolz, I think, is 90 this year, and thank God he's still alive.
Yeah.
So I mean that should be changed. And as you say, I mean, this should be studied first. I mean, what people are perceptive. I mean, what is receptive in Russian audiences? What they really kind of want to hear. And I've been engaged in one of the research projects to kind of to understand how the Russian media audiences are segmented right now during the war. And there's interesting kind of discovery, there are many interesting discoveries in this research, that the center of the Russian audience is undecided. It's about 50% of the people who are viewers of propaganda television on one hand, but on the other hand, they do not repeat exactly what this propaganda is saying to them. Therefore, they probably have open mind and could be converted into kind of more critical thinking mode.
That's all we have time for. Before I bring in Sherry to round things off and to talk about our next First Monday, let me thank Mark, Vasily, Michelle, Jean for a wonderful discussion, which I think, based on the questions, sets us up for a later conversation about what's happening today, because there's so much, or maybe we need a different panel to build on the technical issues and strategy issues of the moment. But we have a wonderful foundation, I think, for understanding what worked in the 80s. Over to you, Sherry.
Thanks so much, Nick. Warm greetings from Arlington, Virginia. I want to thank everyone on this webinar in our audience for joining us today. And I want to say Bolshoye Spasiba, a huge thank you to Nick Hull for orchestrating such an informative and knowledgeable panel. Michelle, Mark, Jean, Vasily, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. I also want to express gratitude to our tech hosts, Carla Cabrera Cuadrado, our primary tech host, and Claudia Del Pozo, our backup tech host. I also invite each of you to join us January 9th for the next First Monday Forum. Many of you are already familiar with and know Dr. Nancy Snow, and she spent many years in Asia, has a new book, and will be talking about Japanese public diplomacy and the legacy of Abe. So I hope you will join us on January 9th. Finally, on behalf of the Public Diplomacy Council of America, as well as the USC Annenberg Center for Communication Policy and Leadership, I wish you a wonder-filled and meaningful holiday season. We look forward to seeing you in 2023. All best.
Thanks, everybody.